Let's bring your attention once again to the situation around voting day in and around the country from tomorrow. Of course, part of our analysis is with Dr. Imraan Buccus, who is with us here in our studios at the National Results Operations Center. We've had a fascinating discussion so far, Doc, about, I suppose, the evolution of liberation movements, for lack of a better term. But this election is also about young people, and typically you'll hear a lot of pundits, perhaps yourselves, speaking about young people being disillusioned and therefore not wanting to be part of this democratic process. I wonder whether you resonate with that sentiment, given what we've seen even in the past couple of decades in this country.
Sure. Well, perhaps let's paint some context, right? South Africa is a country of young people, like countries across Africa. More than 50% are under 30. So, if you want to do well at an election across the African continent, you need to target young people. And the one statistic we know is that we have about 4.5 million registered in the 18 to 29-year-old category, of about a little over 11 million. That's not a great figure. And we often say that young people are apathetic, and that's not true for South Africa. It's true across the world. Under 30 young people tend not to turn up to vote. But I would contest this idea that young people are politically apathetic. I think young people might be electorally apathetic. They might not turn up at the polls. But in a country like South Africa, I don't think we should measure political participation by electoral participation. There are many young people in communities, in social movements that are really politically active, focused on fundamentally changing the context they live in, but may reject the vote. And we had, for example, about 10 years ago, abahlali in KZN.
Right.
A number of young people, politically active, but they said, well, we're disowning the electoral process because voting is not bringing us any change. So can we say they're not politically active? Certainly we can't. They are politically active, but maybe not opting to participate in an election. And that might be a problem. But I think we see it even with the EFF. The EFF is kind of hovering around that 10% mark. Yet its target base is young people under 35. And we know the EFF resonates in a really significant way with young people.
Yeah.
But the reality is that young people are not turning up to make that mark, right? But I think the other thing we face in South Africa is of the 50% I spoke about of young people, the majority are desperately poor and unemployed. They live on the margins. If I can take a moment to reflect on what happened in 2009-10 in Tunisia, young people were unemployed, desperately poor, and a young man was selling his wares on the street, trying to eke out a living, Mohamed Bouazizi. The cops were troubling him, asking him for a bribe, asking him to engage in corruption, confiscating his goods. And what did the young man do? He bought himself some petrol, poured it on himself and set himself alight. He said, I just can't do it anymore. I'm just trying to eke out a living. He tried to get audience with the governor declined and chased him away. But his death gave rise to what we now know as the Arab Spring. And the point I'm making is what gave rise to the Arab Spring was youth unemployment and poverty.
Yeah.
And those are the ingredients we have here. Like Mobilization has been warning us for a long time, we have those ingredients. But perhaps the question we should be asking, why then not the African Spring here or the Arab Spring here? I mean, an iteration of the Arab Spring here. And many political analysts will tell you it's got to do with liberation dividend. Young people would say, well, we can't do that to the ANC. They brought us liberation. They were in prison. They were on the front lines. So liberation dividend is giving gratitude to the liberation movement.
That's interesting. You think
Yeah.
so? You think that the sentiment generally among young people is still to pay homage to the governing party?
Well, yes and no.
Right.
It was. But you're right. It's changing rapidly. If you talk to young people today, they'll say, well, we've heard enough about your time on Robben Island and what you did for us. We're deeply grateful. But we want jobs. We want the streetlights to work and we want the potholes fixed. And we don't care about how long you were on Robben Island. We've heard that story enough. And I think liberation movements continue to mobilize historical liberation to kind of, prolong their existence, do you recall what we did for you? We sacrificed. But I think young people are tiring of the story, and the aura of liberation is wearing out. And I think as the romance of the liberation wears out, not only is the ANC in trouble, but I think the country is in trouble. You cannot continue with a country of young people living on the margins, desperately poor, marginalized, and when they look from Alex across the street, they see utter opulence in Sandton.
Right.
You know, you see, you know, Porsches and Ferraris and $1 million apartments. So that vulgarity of disparity certainly can't continue. And I think that should worry not only the ANC, but that should worry all of us.
Fascinating thoughts. There was a moment where it felt like young people were, I don't want to say finding their voices, because that always presumes that young people didn't know what they wanted, but during the 2016, 2015 roads and fees must fall movements, there was this reinvigoration, if you like, of this kind of outward activism with social movements springing up, specifically in universities. It's difficult to tell now what's happened to that, you know, whether some of the people who led those movements are now officially in government trying to push for change, or whether it's kind of fizzled out. I mean, either way, I, for example, wouldn't be able to tell you what a fees must fall or roads must fall policy position would be, at least in this election.
Well, I don't think it's fizzled out. And I think, yes, we went through a period of, I think in the late 90s, perhaps a period of political apathy. You know, young people, understandably, we're tired of hearing about liberation. We're now kind of basking in the glory of liberation. But I think what happened in 2016, that kind of mobilization really shook the ground in South Africa. And I think Wits was the kind of epicenter of mobilization. And I think those young people in many ways changed the course of our history. And they really disrupted this idea that young people are apathetic. Young people were able to mobilize. And I think what was really fascinating about Fees Must Fall is that many of those people on the front lines were from the middle classes. They came from, you know, kind of privileged backgrounds. They have materially what many people in the country don't have, but they chose to be on the front line. And I think politically that's fascinating, because generally, you know, the middle classes are not the ones who want to overthrow society, because they have a stake in society. You know, we have this interest and that material interest, so we don't want the chaos. And I think that was different to 2016. And I think not only 2016, but young people over the last decade to two have shown to us that they are not politically apathetic. And I think this is really, the word they use is woke, right?
Yes.
A woke generation that's going to stand up. And we're seeing it across the world. If you look at young students on American campuses standing up against Israeli aggression and saying, no, this can't continue. The government of Netanyahu cannot continue with the genocide with us standing back and watching it. And I think across the world, young people are standing up. I would suggest that, you know, one of the kind of catalyst for this was the African Spring or the Arab Spring. And I would even say that the American iteration of that was the Occupy movement in 2011. And then, of course, Black Lives followed. And I don't think Black Lives was essentially only an American thing. It had resonance across the world.
Absolutely.
You know, it inspired young black people across the world to stand up to power. And I'm hoping we continue to see that. That young people continue to be on the front lines of seeking justice.
Closer to home, we also saw the End SARS protest in Nigeria, of course. Many people suggesting that that was largely led by young people in that country. And Hakainde Hichilema's own presidency in Zambia is said to have been something driven mainly by young people. I'm only painting this picture to try draw any kind of connection to our country around whether or not we could ever have a story about young people in this election. You know, are you confident that when the results are announced later this week, we'll be able to say this is the president that young people actually wanted?
I don't think we're at that point yet. You know, I would have loved to say yes, and I followed the Hichilema story in Zambia closely, and I've worked with young people in Zambia with the Patriotic Front, with Hichilema's party, with UNIP. And you're right, in large part, the Zambian mobilization is driven by young people. In the South African case, if you have 4.5 million young people registered of 11 million, we then need to think about, turnout.
Yeah.
How many of the 4.5 million will turn out? And I think between eligible voters, those registered and those who turn up, there's a huge gap. So, I don't think we're at the point where we can say the leadership in the country has been driven by young people. I think we could reach that point. It's going to take a lot more civic education, mass mobilization, political education
Right.
For us to reach that point. But I don't think we're at that point yet.